Elisabeth Madden. I was Elizabeth Knight. I grew up in Kenya, where my father was a padre, a chaplain to the English-speaking population in a very large area, covering the size almost of England and Wales, and covered the equator. In that space, there were about 5 or 6 churches. He travelled between them, and if there wasn't a church in an area, then we used to have our services in people's homes or in the clubs. It was an amazing place to grow up in. In 1952, we heard that Princess Elisabeth and her husband, Prince Philip, were coming to Kenya at the beginning of a world trip. And my father had a letter from the governor of Kenya saying that Princess Elisabeth and her husband would like to worship in a church as private individuals on Sunday the 3rd of February. And so the preparations were made. They decided that the nearest church that was convenient to Sagana Lodge, which is where they were staying, was this very small church that had been built on land given by somebody in the area. A very simple church with just chairs, I believe. No organist, no choir, nothing like that. And so we prepared for the visit. You may remember that Sagana Lodge was given to them as a wedding present by the people of Kenya. They visited it, I think, at the very beginning of February, perhaps February the 1st or 2nd, and they were staying there. And that was on the Sunday, February the 3rd, that they said they'd like to come to a service. People came from far and wide, bringing flowers to make the church look beautiful. It was a lovely part of the country to live in, beautiful flowers and very verdant. My mother wrote later to my grandmother saying that they brought 3-foot delphiniums and carnations and roses to decorate the church. So the Queen and Prince Philip came very informally. I've got a photograph. There were no official photographs allowed, but there was a photograph taken of them arriving at the church, and just with them and my father. So the service continued, and apparently at the end of it I was so excited and said to my mother, "I'm so pleased that you married Daddy." So she thought that was quite a nice thing. I don't think she'd probably married anybody else, but anyway, I was very pleased that she'd married my father. And so that was that day. And then I think the next day, Princess Elisabeth and Prince Philip went, which is quite well documented, went to Treetops, which was a tree house set in a forest quite near to a place called Neri. And you perhaps will have heard how she went up to Treetops as a princess. And during that night, which must have been the night of February the 5th, King George VI died. And so she, unbeknown to her, she came down the steps as a queen. That tree house has now been renovated and has thousands of visitors every year. I'd love to go, but I haven't. History tells us that Prince Philip was told of King George VI's death, and in Sagana Lodge he told the Queen of her father's death. And you can only imagine the shock and the sadness that she felt. And so on February the 6th, there had been a wedding in the little place where we lived, a little village called Nanyuki. And my father had taken the service, and he and the congregation had left the little township where we lived and gone, I think, either to the reception. My father was not very good ever at staying very long at reception, so I imagine they probably went to the reception and left, and he went to see somebody and then heard a message from one of the few people still in the town, the butcher, whose name was Jack Wright, somehow contacted people and said that the Queen would be leaving from Nanyuki Airport in a few hours' time on her way back to England. My parents came and fetched my brother and we stood at a little crossroads in Nanyuki, which was decked out completely with bunting, ready for the visit that should have taken place the next day on February the 7th, when Prince Philip and Princess Elizabeth were due to go to the airfield for a sort of military review. And so, of course, the bunting had all been put up ready for this event. We stood underneath the bunting, and as I remember it, there were perhaps 8 or 10 of us standing there, my parents, my brother and I, and perhaps 1 or 2 other people. I know it was not very many, but more than just us, I think. And so this cavalcade, which wasn't really a cavalcade, it was a car, perhaps 2 cars. Security wasn't quite such a high issue in those days. And as the car passed, we sort of felt that the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, somehow recognised my father, and it was almost as if the Duke of Edinburgh had nudged the Queen and said, oh look, there's the person who took the service on Sunday. So they went down one road and we went back to our house on the other road, and just a very few minutes later we saw a plane take off. Not many planes took off from the airfield. It was the army airfield, and so not very well used. But this plane took off, and I remember standing in floods of tears because the King had died, and perhaps even more poignantly because it was actually my 10th birthday. And 10th birthdays are very important when you're 10. And so we waved, realising that, I don't think perhaps I realised, but my parents perhaps realised that they'd seen a little bit of history.
All these wonderful letters and photographs, many of which will be at this exhibition. Will you be attending the exhibition?
Yes, I look forward to seeing other people's contributions and hearing the stories of other people as well, because we've all had such different experiences, and it'd be good to share those with other people, and I'd be very happy to share my experiences with those who are interested.
Well, I feel privileged. Thank you so much for such a wonderful story, backed up by the most unbelievable photographs that I never dreamed I would get sight of.
Yeah.
I'm extremely grateful to you. Thank you very much indeed.